All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. This evening, we are indeed humbled and privileged to welcome two very special guests this evening who will talk to us about the Center for Civil Rights Research that is based right here at the University of South Carolina, here in Columbia, South Carolina. Our guests this evening are, of course, Dr. Bobby Donaldson, Associate Professor of History at USC and Director of the USC Center for Civil Rights History and Research, and also Mr. Frank Goss, who is here as the Outreach Coordinator for the center as well. These two gentlemen have done yeoman's work in trying to get the history of this city out to people in South Carolina and around the world. And indeed, Dr. Donaldson has really taken the lead in making sure that folks are aware of the rich history of civil rights and human rights activism right here in the Palmetto State. So what you're about to hear this evening is a lot more about what the center does, some of the things we're doing right now, and why institutions like this are so critical and so valuable to making sure that folks understand South Carolina for more than the Strom Thurmonds and John C. Calhouns and Jeffrey Burns. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podium, Dr. Bobby Donaldson.
Thank you very much. So Frank, we might want to bring that up here. Thank you very much, Dr. Green. I'm honored to be here tonight, and I want to thank Brett Bursey for the opportunity to be here at the Modjeska Simkins School. This is not my first time present here.
And Dr. Green also deserves praise.
I just mentioned him.
Oh.
Are part of a long tradition of organizations and individuals seeking to challenge the received histories around us and seeking to reconstruct history. Two individuals see on the screen, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, often described as the father of Negro history, established an organization in the early teens called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. In addition, he created a journal to accompany this organization called the Journal of Negro History, which is still in publication today, known as the Journal of African American History. In 1926, Dr. Carter G. Woodson established an initiative called Negro History Week that evolved into African American History Month. And when you go back to look at Dr. Woodson's mission and vision for Negro History Week, you will see that Dr. Woodson was deeply concerned about the histories that were overlooked, histories that were suppressed, histories that were erased in public education. And he was of the mind that there needed to be insurgent organization that would tell a complete history. So what does Dr. Woodson do in addition to establishing Negro History Week? He established a Negro history curriculum. He establishes Negro history kits. And then he begins to train citizens to be teachers. Citizens who would go into libraries, citizens who would go into churches and community organizations and teach this history. In 1937, the president of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History was a woman from Maysville, South Carolina, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And October 31st of 1937, Dr. Bethune speaks to the national meeting of the Association for Negro life and history. And she speaks in the midst of the Great Depression. And she said during her address that one of the extreme challenges facing Black children, Negro children in America, is that they are being intentionally denied their history. And then she said, we should not expect schools to be the only venue to impart history to our children. We should take ownership of that history. We should develop a curriculum that will train Black children from the cradle to the grave, from kindergarten to high school to college. And we should do so at whatever cost, even if it breaks the back of the kingdom. And in that address, she says, it is our obligation and our sacred duty to teach them that history. So I say that preface to say that we gather here tonight on the corner of Elmwood and Marion in downtown Columbia as part of a great and noble tradition of what I call insurgent history. You can clap. So when you go back and look at Negro History Week and look at all the various publications that emerged from that, you will see that what we're doing tonight is that we are extending the mission and the reach and the vision of people like Dr. Carter G. Woodson and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. By doing what? By making all of us citizens, educators, with the hope and expectation that when you graduate from this august academy called the Modjeska Simkins School, that you will not just be informed, but what? You will be empowered. And you will be called to go out beyond this place and teach this history. That is in many respects what we are doing at the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. Now, this organization that I lead now was not something that was on my professional agenda. Let me explain how certain histories works. In 2014, the University of South Carolina wanted to build upon about 4 decades of work in acquiring, preserving, and archiving civil rights and African-American collections. And one of the collections they were eager to acquire was the collection of a man whose name was James E. Clyburn. James Clyburn, whose first professional job was as a history teacher, told the dean of the college, the dean of the libraries at the time, the question was, Congressman Clyburn, will you commit your papers to the University of South Carolina? Congressman Clyburn's response was, hell no, I shall not. Because he was committed to his alma mater, South Carolina State University in Orangeburg. Congressman Clyburn had already deposited some of his papers in Orangeburg, but was increasingly concerned about the status of that collection and about the degree to which that collection would ultimately be processed. So after he had told the dean, hell no, I talked to him and told him about some of the work that we were doing. And he ultimately said this, I would be willing to commit my papers on a number of conditions. And there were a number of conditions. One would be a clear working memorandum of agreement with South Carolina State, and that we would help to assist them not only in preserving his papers, but the papers of other collections on that campus, including the collection of the Palmetto Medical Association, a collection that Dr. Gallman knows extremely well. He also said, I want, these were his instructions, an organization that will be equipped and funded at the University of South Carolina to use collections to advance teaching, to enable research of scholars, and most importantly, to educate the wider public beyond campus. And in many respects, that is what we've been doing since the fall of 2015. In November of 2015, only months after the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, we announced the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. And we announced that we were hoping to continue upon the promises that we made to Congressman Clyburn. We were committed to advancing scholarship, we were committed to advancing teaching, and we were committed to taking these resources to the community. But there was a real serious problem beyond those commitments. There was not one dime committed to the project, except for salary during the summer and a couple of graduate students. And I'll tell you in a moment how we push to change that. So here's a desk in our office. Before the center was announced, and Brett Bursey, Dr. Gallman, and Robert Green, and others who have been in those collections know this, there were about 70 or 80, between 70 and 80, depending on how you qualify it, different collections already housed at the University of South Carolina. Those collections went from the papers of the South Carolina Council on Human Relations to the papers of the NAACP, Ida Quincy Newman, Modjeska, Monteith Simkins, Ida Quincy Newman. But the broader public did not know about these collections being housed at the university. And so the job of the center initially was simply to amplify and to educate the public on these collections, to remind people of what were those collections already in place, but at the same time to open the door for a new collection. So here's a photograph. Frank, is that you in the back? Yes. Frank Goss, Bobby Donaldson at a storage unit. And we were at a storage unit off of North Main, and we had talked to a gentleman who was eager that his father's papers be preserved. Some of you know the gentleman. His father was Dr. John Stevenson, first African-American superintendent of schools. And here was a collection that had been in storage since Dr. Stevenson's passing, that slowly but surely came to campus with the commitment that that collection would be utilized for teaching research and ultimately would be digitized. Other collections beyond those of Dr. Stevenson includes the collection of a man named James T. McCain. Now, who in the room has heard of Professor McCain before? James T. McCain was a native of Sumter, South Carolina. James T. McCain was an early member of the NAACP. James T. McCain became a staff member of the South Carolina Council on Human Relations. He was an educator in both Sumter and Marion at Morris College. But perhaps most importantly, James T. McCain was a field organizer for the Congress on Racial Equality, known as CORE. And we're now able to document James McCain's collection because a field archivist over 40 years ago named Dr. Tom Johnson visited James McCain in his Sumter home, and Mr. McCain, mindful that his legacy might be easily erased, committed his papers to the university. His papers include letters, they include photographs, and they include date books. Notice this date book from 1961. In this date book, James McCain chronicles on the 18th, 11 arrested at Greenville roller skating rink. And then on the other page, he talks about civil rights activities in Sumter, Rock Hill, and other communities. So here is James McCain's daily diary, where he is taking note of events occurring in the state. And we're now digitizing these series of date books so that anyone in this room can have access. In fact, these date books can be easily found on our website. Within the date books, you will discover the planning for a major movement that takes place in May of 1961. James McCain is one of the organizers of this major initiative. It is called the Freedom Rise. And as you turn the date book of James McCain's papers, you will see a play-by-play, almost like a Twitter feed, of what is taking place from Washington, D.C. to Charlotte, from Charlotte to Chester, from Chester to Rock Hill, or Rock Hill, Chester, Chester, Winsboro, Winsboro, Sumter, Sumter, Columbia, Columbia, Augusta, Augusta, Atlanta, Atlanta, Anniston, Anniston, Birmingham, Birmingham, Montgomery, page by page. Now imagine if that collection had not been preserved. So now students at Claflin, students at South Carolina State, students at USC now have access to this rich collection because it was preserved. Or this is from 1942. Let me read the top of it. The NAACP met in a special call meeting at Mount Pisgah AME Church. The meeting was called together by its former president, Professor J.T. McCain. Invocation was given by Reverend P.E. Mingo, pastor of Emmanuel Methodist Church. After deliberating for a few minutes, Professor McCain called for a financial report from the treasurer, Dr. B.T. Williams. Following the former treasurer's report, Professor McCain informed the group that the organization did not exist since failing to live up to the constitution of said organization. And as you pin through the Sumter Minute Book of the NAACP, you will see citizens in Sumter discussing a number of important civil rights actions, including the right to vote, including the equalization of teacher salaries. In fact, the campaign to equalize teacher salaries that lead to two major lawsuits in the mid-1940s emerges from Sumter, led by James McCain and his cousin, whose name was Osceola McCain, who we may talk about in a few moments. But this minute book is now a part of the archives at the University of South Carolina, and it's also being digitized. Earlier, I mentioned Rock Hill. Notice this page from February 23rd, 1961. It's from the York County Prison. It was sent to a woman named Alice Spearman, white woman, executive director of the South Carolina Council on Human Relations. Ms. Spearman kept her kind of correspondence. Her correspondence was organized chronologically. So as we were preparing for an exhibit, we come across February 23rd, 1961. And it is a letter by a man whose name was Thomas, what's the last name? Gaither. Thomas Gaither. Thomas Gaither was a recent graduate of Claflin University in Orangeburg, who was also a protege of James McCain of Sumter. Thomas Gaither graduates from Claflin and becomes a field operator. And he begins organizing student leaders and demonstrators across the South. Tom Gaither is from the little community of Great Falls, South Carolina, not too far from Rock Hill. So he goes into Rock Hill and organizes students at Clinton Junior College and Friendship Junior College. And on February 1st of 1961, 1 year after the anniversary of sit-ins in Greensboro, students engage in sit-ins in downtown Rock Hill, South Carolina. But what makes the sit-in demonstrations in Rock Hill unique and different than before? What makes it unique is that these young men, 10 of them, refuse bail and engage in what is called a jail no bail campaign. Why do they do this? To amplify. They said, The routine had been, all of us would go and sit in, and we would be bailed out almost immediately.
Yeah.
Well, let's stop that tradition. Let's hold forth in jail to dramatize conditions, and they dramatize. They stay in jail over 30 days, and not just your ordinary jail, chain gang jail. They become part of the chain gang system of York County. Thomas Gaither, on February 23rd, writes a note to Alice Spearman, acknowledging why they stayed in jail, explaining the conditions why they're in jail. Now, letter from the jail, doesn't sound familiar? Well before April of '63, we have other letters from jail. Not only do we have this letter from jail, but after further research, we have another letter a week later from jail. In this letter, this is on the first page, which is now online, Tom Gaither says, as we are now exiting jail, there are others from this organization called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who remain in jail. And among those who remain in jail is a man named Charles Sherrod, who just recently passed away from Albany, Georgia, and this young woman named Diane Nash. Well, can I just tell you how shocked I was as I kept going through these letters, and guess what? Found a letter from jail from Diane Nash, but her letter was not addressed to Alice Spearman. It was addressed to the chief hypocrite in charge, Ernest Hollins. And she began to explain how unjust it was that she and all of her compatriots are in jail for simply demanding their rights as citizens in this country. So that letter is now part of our digital collection. Also, timely, that is part of our collection, is this album from 1870s to 1890s. And it is the autograph book of a member of the NAACP of Columbia, one of the earliest members of the NAACP. Her name was Celia Emma Dow Saxon. Celia Emma Dow Saxon was born in 1857, and she dies in 1935. Celia Dow Saxon was a committed and devoted teacher. She spent 57 years teaching in the classroom. And it is said that on the night before her death, she's grading paper. She was still teaching and dies grading paper. We have now part of Celia Dow Saxon's collection, which is timely, since just last Friday, the University of South Carolina unveiled this building. Now, let me add an editorial comment. This building is in the heart of a community that I hope we'll talk about in a moment, called the Ward 1 neighborhood. A community that was deliberately and intentionally erased and demolished to expand the University of South Carolina. So when we dedicated this building on last Friday, there were several Ward 1 residents who were present, who were members who had gone to the Celia Dow Saxon School, but who remained quite indignant about the encroachment of the University of South Carolina on their community. Now, in the summer of 2020, members of Ward 1 wrote a letter to the Board of Trustees of the University of South Carolina. And they argued this: we believe that the site of our original school, the Celia Dow Saxon School, should be renamed in honor of Celia Dow Saxon. Site of that school is the swimming pool of the Strom Thurmond Wellness Center. So rather than renaming, rather than challenging the Heritage Act of South Carolina, our Board of Trustees found this building, which is a great building, by the way, and renamed it in honor of Celia Dow Saxon. And the goal ultimately is that her history will be told. And I'm not sure they even know her history. But wait till we get finished. That is the marker that is in front of the Strom Thurmond Wellness Center for Celia Dow Saxon. This is Miss Saxon. Celia Dow Saxon, who was a teacher of social studies, who had mentored several people of note, including a man named Lincoln C. Jenkins Jr., who becomes a civil rights attorney, including a man named Willie T. Smith, who's from the Arsenal Hill community, who becomes a civil rights attorney in Greenville. And also a man named Matthew J. Perry, who becomes a federal judge and civil rights attorney as well. In addition to acquiring collections, we're also acquiring electronic collections as well. And so we are now developing through some funding that we've committed to acquire all the digital papers of the Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News, the Afro-American, the Atlanta Daily World, and all those papers, which were national papers in the early part of the 20th century, are now part of the university's collection. In addition, we are moving forward on digitizing other collections. So now the Lighthouse and Informer newspaper, edited by John McCrae, has been digitized to the extent that we have the original. In addition, the collection of the Palmetto Leader newspaper has been digitized. So in addition to the digitalization of photographs and newspapers, another important collection I want to make sure you are aware of is the digitalization of moving image material. So old television news footage. I showed you the letter from Tom Gaither, February 23rd of 1961. Around the very same time that Tom Gaither wrote that letter, students from Nashville, Tennessee came to the York County Jail to show their support of the young men who remained in jail for those 30 days. And we have moving footage from February of 1961, where the cameras are panning the audience of those young people. And you'll see in the footage, James McCain standing. You will see a man named Pete Strom, who is head of SLED. And you'll also see a young man whose head is turned in that direction. Now, in the original description of the footage, it said unknown students gathered at the York County Jail. And as we're watching the footage, it goes by, and the guy who was running the computer, I said, press rewind. And I said, stop right there. And I forgot who was in the room. But I said, do you all see who I see? No one could see it. I said, the guy with his head turned, I think I know who that is. It was John Lewis. John Lewis has a very famous collection called March, an illustrated autobiography. And in his autobiography, John Lewis makes the following claim. John Lewis said his first time in South Carolina was during the Freedom Rides in May of 1961. Now that stands out in his mind because it was the first time he was beaten in Rock Hill. Well, John Lewis comes later and gets an honorary degree from the University of South Carolina. And John Lewis is sitting in my office. That's that picture. He's signing March. And I had to break the news to John Lewis. I had to tell him there was an error in his book. I said, Congressman, your first visit to South Carolina was not in May of 1961. He looks at me. He's like, what are you talking about? I said, it was in February of 61. And we showed him the footage. Wow. He had no recollection. All he could say was, look at all the hair I had. I say this because we've learned long enough, and Frank's been part of my team, so much of what people endure and experience is locked away. And very often these photographs, these newspapers, this footage almost unlocks a memory in individuals. I can't tell you the number of people when I approach them who have no memory of being in a sit-in or a demonstration. There's no memory until we pull out the photograph and begin to show them. Another important initiative of the center is oral interviews. Many of these oral interviews are now being placed online. Among those, these are photographs of individuals from Sumter. When we were in Sumter earlier this year as part of our Justice for All exhibit, including James Felder, a familiar face here at the Modjeska Simkins School. One of the persons I had the great pleasure of interviewing, perhaps the one that stands out most, is a woman named Donnella Brown Wilson. That's Miss Wilson in the red outfit, voting in 2004. Miss Wilson lived to be 108 years old. She was born in 1909. Anyone ever heard of Fort Mott, South Carolina? In Calhoun County. She leaves Fort Mott around the age of 5, takes a train from Fort Mott and arrives in Columbia at Union Station. Union Station, California dreaming. She walks a couple of blocks and her home is at the intersection of Blossom and Gates Street. Blossom and Park. Now, where the Don Staley practice arena is located. Miss Wilson then moves to Waverly on Height Street and becomes very active in the NAACP, is an educator. And so I got to interview Miss Wilson when she was about 99 years old. When I interviewed Miss Wilson, she was legally blind. And when I interviewed Miss Wilson, she had a significant hearing impairment. So imagine trying to conduct an interview in that circumstance. So here's how it went. Miss Wilson will be here, her daughter here, and I'm standing here. I would pose a question to the daughter. The daughter would shout the question to Miss Wilson. Once Miss Wilson heard the question, she would offer a recitation that was encyclopedic about what she witnessed, what she experienced. Now, remind you, Ms. Wilson, legally blind, Ms. Wilson can barely hear. So at one point during the course of the conversation, Ms. Wilson leans into her daughter and says, "Patricia, that's Dr. Donaldson?" He said, "Yes, Mama, that's Dr. Donaldson." She said, "Is he colored?" "Is he colored?" Patricia's almost embarrassed. She says, "Yes, Mama, he's Black." Ms. Wilson says, "Good." And then she begins to talk about this point, which I did not know. When Ms. Wilson lived at the corner of Park and Blossom, her mother, Minnie, was the housekeeper for President Douglas, name I did not know, who was the president of the University of South Carolina in the 1920s. Now, Donnella is a teenager by this point. So she said she remembered coming to the campus of the University of South Carolina and knowing that the only Black people permitted to be on that campus were those in uniform. And those in uniform at that time never imagined a day when there would be anyone like Frank Gause, a Bobby Donaldson, or a PhD like Robert Greene at the university. So she talked about how ironic it was. I'm sitting in her living room working at that University of South Carolina. And as we talked about the work we were doing, she said something that we now use as our tagline. She said, "Well, I'm glad you all are collecting this history. I'm glad you're archiving it. This might be a theme for the Modjeska School. History has no purpose unless you use it." So what I want to talk about for the remainder of time is how we're using this history. But before I go further, take a look at this photograph. This is Miss Wilson in Fort Mott in the 1930s. This is Miss Wilson teaching her class, one class, not a school, her class.
Wow.
How many students? It doesn't matter. Enough. Enough. And if you look closely, you will see many of those students are coming to school with no shoes. Now, when I interviewed Ms. Wilson, she knew about the photograph, but she could not see it, but she knew clearly that photograph. And she talked about the long arc of change between the 1930s and when I talked to her. So how are we following the mission of Ms. Wilson? How are we putting these collections to work? We are putting these collections to work by supporting scholars, graduate students, by amplifying our various collections. Just 2 weeks ago, Frank and I were in Atlanta at the National Council of Public History, reminding people around the country of the vital history in South Carolina. And Frank can amplify. Frank, the reaction was what?
Overwhelming for most. They were shocked to know of the history that is here in the state. And we're very impressed with how well we've been documenting the history to amplify it into the national conversation.
Frank's been too polite. There were people there who had no knowledge whatsoever that there was a movement in this state. Who just called John C. Calhoun and Fritz Hollings, Strom Thurmond? That's what many people know, but not the opposition to these major figures. So when we talked about the movement of a Rock Hill, well, first of all, where is Rock Hill? This is part of what we are, the kind of the missionary work beyond South Carolina is to amplify that. Here's a woman named Dr. Darlene Clark Hine, Google her. Dr. Darlene Clark Hine, one of the most accomplished African-American historians in current time. What'd you say?
In the world.
Absolutely. Who is writing a book about Dr. Matilda Evans from Columbia. For the second, I know Dr. Gall will challenge, the second African-American woman licensed to practice medicine in South Carolina. We've also helped the project that her husband, Dr. William Hine, has written a history of South Carolina State, published by the University of South Carolina Press, that talks about the critical role of South Carolina State in the larger civil rights movement. How else do we utilize this history? We utilize this history by doing exactly what the Modjeska Simkins School is doing, by making sure that we are training students and teachers in this role. In the photograph on the right, that's Frank in the big town of Hartsville, South Carolina. We've been part of a traveling civil rights exhibit that has taken us from Sumter to the Martin Luther King Jr. Park here in Columbia, to Orangeburg, to Hartsville. And on the same day we left Hartsville, we went to Spartanburg. And that's where we are now. And at each of these sites, Frank and others are engaged in teacher training programs. Frank, you want to talk about some of the goals of those projects?
Some of the major goals of the project is to, one, first, build the content.
Talk to the ceiling, Frank, people in Zoom can't hear you.
Okay. Some of the major goals of the project is to build content for teachers. Just like most of the people we ran into in Atlanta, they're unfamiliar with the history in South Carolina, not just nationally, but here locally in the state. So we want to build content, make sure that they are aware of different movements, different situations that took place in the state. And then not only give them the content, but teach them how to teach the content. None of this is in the textbook. And so how do you teach a photograph and really get kids to think critically about what they see? How do you teach the letter that you saw to really understand what was taking place in Rock Hill, so that they can understand that just like those people who were in jail in Rock Hill, they can be active and engaged in their own communities to challenge the same inequities that they see today. And so what we do is we provide them content, and then we teach them how to content through modeling. And once we model it, we give it to them, and we turn them into lead teachers, master teachers, so that they can now go back to their schools and really share the content, share the teaching practices, so that it becomes viral. And now we're influencing teachers across the state of South Carolina.
And on our website, you will see some of the work that Frank and others have done. It includes several modules that we've done with South Carolina ETV, where we've taken historic school sites and we've developed lesson plans and teaching guides on those sites. Those sites include the historic Booker T. Washington High School here in Columbia. They include Scotch Branch School in Somerton, we'll talk about in a moment. It includes the Penn Center. It includes Bettis Academy in Trenton, South Carolina. And it also includes a school called the Lamar High School, a school that made national news in March of 1970, when white parents disrupted school integration by attacking school buses that carried Black children. And in that module, you will hear the testimonies of the young men who were on that bus when it was attacked, as SLED stood on the sidelines and watched it unfold. It was a gripping account of what transpired. Also, Frank is right, not only have we been training South Carolina teachers, but we've also trained national teachers. I forgot now, 2 years ago, we did a virtual training session on Reconstruction. And this was a training session training teachers from across the country about the Reconstruction history of South Carolina. And that content is now widely available as well. So in addition to training teachers, we also engage in community outreach. And so Frank's title is Program Coordinator, what's your official title?
Coordinator for Outreach and Education.
Frank is a missionary. That's what he does. He goes out all over the state promoting the work of the Civil Rights Center and amplifying the work we do. In addition to the training sessions, we've also received funds from the South Carolina Humanities Council, as well as South Carolina Humanities Council, as well as the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission, to do training sessions throughout the state of South Carolina, built around the content that you have before you. In addition, we also do a series of public engagements throughout South Carolina. Perhaps our most notable accomplishment is the Justice for All exhibit. Now, can they see that screen here and here?
Say again?
Can the crowd here see my screen?
No, you will need to share your screen again.
All right.
To the Zoom.
I don't know. So when I talked about traveling around the state of South Carolina, one of the projects that has kept us extremely busy over the past year is this project called Justice for All, South Carolina and the American Civil Rights Movement. This project emerged in the spring of 2019. This was a project that for 6 months showcased on the campus of the University of South Carolina, selected items from 60 different collections that chronicled the history of civil rights struggle from Reconstruction to 1970. That collection remained on campus for 6 months. And in August of 2019, we very carefully packed up that material and placed it back in archival collections. But ultimately what occurred is, as more demands were placed on our time and expectations, we secured funding from the South Carolina Humanities Council, and we also secured $1 million from an organization called the Williams Company that have enabled us to take this exhibit out of the archives across the state of South Carolina. And as I mentioned, that exhibit has taken us from Columbia for 3 months in Sumter, from Sumter for 3 months at the Martin Luther King Jr. Park in 5 Points. From there, 3 months in Orangeburg. From there, 3 months in Hartsville. From there, 3 months in Spartanburg. Frank and all of those students have been, colleagues have been on the road. One of the things we forgot to imagine is all the time and effort it would take to carry this exhibit forward. The exhibit is now in Spartanburg. After Spartanburg, we're moving to Beaufort. And from Beaufort, we're going to Georgetown. And after Georgetown, we're coming home. Just to show you where this title came from. This is a photograph from April. What's the date, Robert? Today is 24th.
Yeah.
60 years ago tomorrow, this photograph was taken. This photograph was taken on the tarmac of the Columbia Airport. These students who were from Columbia, a woman named Mary McClellan, Frank, your colleague,
Vivian
Coxum. As much as I know this lady, I'm drawing a blank on her name now. I think Booker Washington class of 1962 from Arsenal Hill. Mr. Isaac Washington, local newspaper publisher. They had heard word that a very distinguished American citizen was coming to Columbia. He was scheduled to speak at the University of South Carolina Law School and at a Columbia motel. They go out to meet him at the airport. And as the gentleman comes down the stairs, he's met by students carrying 2 signs. The gentleman's name is Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General. And he's met by students from Benedict and Allen and local schools. Said, well, we want to remind you where you are. Welcome to South Carolina, land of segregation and discrimination. Let there be justice for all. So this was the title. So we put this photograph in the window about as wide as that window here in front of our library, announcing the exhibit. And we were like, this is from April of '63. Well, the USC admissions office, who give tours around campus, said, could you put a date on that? I said, well, why? So we took that title. And at the time, did not know who these people were. We had an event just like this, and local attorney I.S. Levy Johnson said, I know those people. They were my classmates from Benedict. And since that discovery, they have been active parts of our programming and our exhibit. So in the Justice for All exhibit, you will hear a lot of what we've discussed today, but this is what people see as they travel throughout the various sites around South Carolina. One of the sections is Black Power. This may be moving too fast. We had acquired a lot of material related to Angela Davis. Now, Angela Davis has no direct connection to South Carolina, but because we now have resources, I decided to use some of our funds to expand our holdings well beyond South Carolina. And so a lot of Angela Davis material came up for auction. Because we had the funds, we acquired it. It just so happened that 3 weeks before Angela Davis was to come to South Carolina, that material arrived. So we were now able to not only have Angela Davis items, but signed Angela Davis items, which are now widely available to the public. In that material, you have Stokely Carmichael speaking at South Carolina State University in 1968. You have a gentleman named Oliver's last name, taking over the administration building at Voorhees College in 1969. You have Redfern Deuce marching down Main Street in 1970, and much more. That's part of that collection. All of this can now be seen online. So in the last month, through funding from the university, we've now created a new website called Justice for All. It's justiceforallsc.org. And it provides an immersive introduction to a lot of this material. You can find moving footage, photo, justiceforallsc.org is the collection. That backdrop photograph, by the way, is a band marching in downtown Charleston in April of 1969 during the Charleston hospital strike, which I think Professor Carrie Taylor will discuss with you in the coming weeks. So this photograph shows the exhibit traveling in Sumter. So what becomes of the exhibit once we're done in Georgetown? This is what becomes of it. I mentioned urban renewal and the efforts to demolish African-American communities. So this is the Wheeler Hill neighborhood. Now a community of $500,000 houses, but in 1963 was the heart of a Black community. Booker T. Washington High School was a landmark in the Wheeler Hill community. All of this is demolished to build campus housing. And so if you were to look at a current version of this picture, which I should add, this is now the campus dormitory called East Quad. This is the campus dormitory called South Quad. This was once called University Terrace, is now the Bull Street Garage. This is a part of what was called McBride, which was the fraternity row, which is now part of our library. The only building still standing is this building, which is called the Booker T. Washington Auditorium. It was slated to be demolished. If not demolished, they hope it would just fall down through deferred maintenance. However, in the fall of 2009, at a moment when the university had declared there were no resources to renovate the building, this gentleman, who was from Wheeler Hill, had gone to Walmart. And he had gone to Walmart to purchase some cigars and a lottery ticket. And he won over 280 million. So he said, how much does it cost to renovate my school? Now remember, the university declared they had no resources. So Reverend Solomon Jackson, who is from Wheeler Hill, gave nearly $2 million to renovate his high school. Now remember, the university's master plan, the 2025 master plan, BTW auditorium building was not on it. There was no expectation that this building will be utilized. So Reverend Jackson gave the funds to renovate his high school, and the university added resources to it. What happened there was, go back. This is the building. This is the building still standing. This is what it looked like on Wheat Street. So at the time of 2009, there was no central air and heat in this building. At the time, there was no elevator in the building. And at the time, the bathrooms looked just like they looked in 1956 when the building was built. Now let me repeat that. The building was built in 1956 with funds from what was called the equalization campaign. Funds to equalize schools in the hopes that Negroes would not want to integrate white schools. So there are two structures still standing in that part of Columbia, which are the direct result of what we call Jimmy Burns equalization funds. One is the Booker T. Washington Auditorium. Has anyone ever gone to DePrato's restaurant on Pickens? Right across from DePrato's is a school.
Oh, God.
Oh God, what?
That place is so disgusting.
It did not look disgusting in 56.
Oh.
It was called Benson, state-of-the-art school in 56. Now owned by which university?
USC.
It's owned by USC. And it's now it's challenging.
It's true.
So we're working on that. Remember that I said that, okay? I said that, we're working on that. So Reverend Jackson gave the money that added a new addition that resembled the original building, torn down. And in the new addition, there was HVAC system, in the new addition, modern bathrooms, in the new addition, an elevator. And also throughout the building, the history of the school is told. But Reverend Jackson's nearly $2 million only renovated a portion of the building. It's a vast structure. And in the last 3 years, we've worked with the National Park Service, along with Congressman Clyburn, to now identify $6 million to renovate the complete building. And that building will be the anchor of the first phase of the Civil Rights Center, where this exhibit and other components of what we do will be permanently housed. In addition, there are plans to expand to build a new structure as well that will house the center, that will house Upward Bound, TRIO, Opportunity Scholars, and other federal programs on the same footprint as BTW.
Oh.
Now, I want to stop there and just tell you a few things that are ongoing with the center and then take a break. So in addition to what I discussed, we also have an active walking tour initiative that is done through Columbia 63 that Frank directly leads. We have an active oral history initiative that is going forward. We continue to partner with the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission on social justice conversations. And we also sponsor a number of student initiatives. Just today, I met with a group called the Freedom Riders. These are college students who during spring break went on the Freedom Ride journey. In 1 week now, they went from Washington, D.C. to Mississippi. I said, that's not how it went. And they went from Washington, D.C. to Mississippi and then to Memphis and then back to Columbia. Deeply inspired by what they witnessed and experienced. So now they want to create an organization that will educate the broader student body about what they do, what they witnessed during that period of time. Wow. So we are providing funding for future Freedom Rides across the South. Frank has already told you about some other things we're doing. Frank has led a series of professional development opportunities in Florence District 3, which is Lake City, that is ongoing. On our website, you will find a podcast called Our Story Matters. And next week, is it next week, Frank? You'll be at Black Expo, Columbia.
Weekend of Mother's Day.
Okay. We also have a documentary project underway on Reconstruction. There is currently a Briggs v. Elliott website. There is the renovation of Randolph Cemetery. And also there's a new project called the African American Civil Rights Network. And Brett, we should talk about that because the Simkins school should be on that network. This is a project funded by the National Park Service that identifies sites and organizations that keep the history of civil rights alive. And with that potentially comes funding as well. I want to stop there because I have more to say, but I want to see if there are any questions before we move to the next phase of the conversation.
All right, first off, let's give Dr. Donaldson a hand. Presentation. There are a few questions in the chat as well I want to get to this evening. And also, if there are any questions in the room, please feel free to raise your hands. But the questions in the chat, I think, relate to some of the technical aspects of how the center actually works. And Cecil Cahoon asked earlier this evening, what equipment is being used to digitize Dr. McCain's documents and other documents for storage and online presentation?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. All I know is we got the money. They're trained digital archivists who do that work on state-of-the-art equipment, and I can provide some connections to it.
Show me the money.
Just to give you one example. So with the African American Civil Rights Network, we developed a partnership with the network where they've committed dollars to us to assist other organizations. So with some of the funds, we're working with the Cecil Williams Museum in Orangeburg. And we've also committed $800,000 to digitize civil rights collections. And some of those collections also include photograph collections. And one of those collections I'll talk about in a moment includes the photographs from the 1920s and 30s of a photographer in Colombia named Richard Samuel Roberts. There's a famous book published by the University of South Carolina Press about Richard Roberts called A True Likeness. A true likeness includes 300 photographs. There are 3,000 which have not been seen by the wider public. So we're working on digitizing that.
There, just an aside, there's also a children's book done by Diane Johnson.
All around town.
All around town. It's wonderful.
Really quickly, I know there's a question in the chat about the oral histories. Are they accompanied with transcripts? Yes, they are.
They are.
Go ahead.
Civil rights has always fascinated me, especially the way that when I was growing up, it was hidden in plain sight. The news stations didn't cover it as well. And as I became more interested in some of the Black Power movement figures. And I'm wondering if there's any emphasis on the differences between the civil rights and the Black Power.
Let me preface that by saying one of the initiatives we sponsored is called the Media and Civil Rights Symposium. In that Media and Civil Rights Symposium, we just discussed this very topic. And looking at the degree to which civil rights and Black power has been covered or not covered. And one of the sites, one of the important resources that we just recently acquired. Now, I say acquired, there's some access issues for the general public, but we can work around that. It's the FBI surveillance of the COINTELPRO, of Black Power, Black Nationalist Organization. So one of the topics that I was going to discuss today is something, so Robert Kennedy comes to Columbia, April 25th, 1963. 1 week earlier, there's this man in the photographs who looks like Malcolm X in the photograph. It is Malcolm X in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, the state newspaper, Dr. Gallman, barely mentioned his presence, but the FBI did. And we have the FBI reports chronicling Malcolm X in Columbia. We also have news accounts where there was a famous news journalist named Sam McEwen, who passed away in the last year. And Sam told me directly the state newspaper made a deliberate effort to suppress Malcolm's visit. Malcolm X was scheduled to speak at the largest venue in Columbia, the Township Auditorium. The day before he is to come, forgot the title, Reactionary Militant, I think maybe the title, slated to appear at the township. His application is revoked, and Malcolm X is running around Columbia looking for a venue. And the venue later is a small mosque near C.A. Johnson High School. One of the things and back to your point, many of us assume that the Black Power movement is a movement of the mid to late 60s. When in fact, you find elements of Black Power well before then. So for example, has anyone in the room ever studied Marcus Garvey's movement in South Carolina?
No.
In places like Beaufort or Lincolnville. How do I know this? Because in the governor's papers, who I'm forgetting the governor now, there was a Negro file where the governor of South Carolina instructed the postmaster to intercept all communications from the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So the roots of Black Power and Black nationalism run far deeper. But I think now, because of the digitalization of collections, we're finding more access. Just recently, there was a graduate student at Temple University who sent me, and I'll pass along to you, it was a Black nationalist text from the 1950s, early 50s. And one of the most prominent members of this organization based in Harlem was, forgetting the last name, but the family was from Somerton, South Carolina. And this person was the Somerton correspondent, or whatever this Black nationalist group is. And so the only reason we know about that is the digitalization of collections. So my answer to your question, Dr. Goldman, is I believe the Black Power movement runs deeper in this state than we assume. And these resources are now giving us greater evidence to amplify that. For example, I'm eager to know who the Garveyites were. One of the Garveyites, by the way, was from Newberry, South Carolina. His name was Edward James. Edward James was a mechanic, World War I veteran, whose son is still living. His son is 101 years old. His son is named Bishop F.C. James of the AME Church. And Bishop James remembers his father talking about Garveyite. And he said, you know, I think we had this newspaper called the Negro World that came to the house. Now that was Garvey's newspaper. Now imagine that newspaper coming to Newberry in the 1920s. But that's a project for somebody.
Is there a copy of the speech he gave while he was in Columbia?
Malcolm X? No, there's an FBI transcript. Well, in the FBI transcript, Malcolm X ridicules state leaders. Now this is April. He ridicules the integration of Clemson, and he slams Reverend Ida Quincy Newman. Slams him. And that, by the way, was his birthday, Newman's birthday, April 17th.
Reason.
I gotta say, I enjoyed that because the second he mentioned Malcolm X, everyone perked up.
But wait, Malcolm X is invited to Columbia by the Nation of Islam rooted here, by Black people from, in fact, the guy who is the major leader was named Thomas Shabazz, Thomas Hines, who is from the PD, who comes to Columbia. And on our moving image resource collection, if it's still there, Dr. Goldman, if you search Thomas Shabazz, you will find speeches he gives in Columbia in the mid to late 1960s.
Again, South Carolina is so interesting.
By the way, one last thing I'll say. Malcolm X speaks on April 17th, 1963. Can anyone guess where Martin Luther King Jr. is while Malcolm X is in Columbia? He's in jail in Birmingham. And he's writing the letter from the Birmingham jail. And guess what? In that letter from the Birmingham jail addressed to white ministers, Martin Luther King Jr. speaks about his commitment to nonviolence, his commitment to peaceful integration. But in that letter, he says, by the way, there are others who have other methods. There are others who have other tools and tactics, including the militant Muslims. He does not mention Malcolm X by name, but I had a feeling Dr. King knew exactly where Malcolm was. And when he left Columbia, he went to Charlotte, and he went to Johnson C. Smith. Years ago, we had an exhibit in McKissick, and it was called Define the Quiet. And in one corner, we played Strom Thurmond defying students from coming downtown. And in the other corner, we played Malcolm X at Johnson C. Smith days after being in Columbia. And it was a YouTube clip, and it's gone now. So we're still trying to recover that footage of Malcolm X in Charlotte. Wow. Question. That's a question.
I was so many questions, but I was listening to a talk by Sheikh Dr. Omar Salman about Malcolm X, and he did mention there's a letter that Malcolm X wrote to Dr. Martin Luther King. On some occasion, I think he's saying basically, we're here to support you if you need help. Like I think when Dr. Martin Luther King was threatened by by violence against him, saying, we got your back, basically. So there was collaboration between all different types of civil rights activists.
Yep. And we know that No, the FBI told us. The COINTELPRO papers are provocative. In fact, there are some saying you discover in the COINTELPRO that you don't really want to know. I mean, it's made, in fact, the film just came out about, who's the photographer from Memphis? I'm forgetting his name now, but he was well known. And Ernest Withers, who was the photographer. And assuming the FBI record is correct, he was a paid informant. And you think about how ingenious for J. Edgar Hoover to identify a photographer to be in the midst of the movement.
There was a lecture on Saturday in Orange.
Yes, at Cecil Williams Museum, right. That's correct.
Which reminds me, I would suggest, urge people to go to the museum many times.
Cecil Williams?
Yeah.
Absolutely,
I just love it.
absolutely.
I heard Cecil lecture in Charleston yesterday.
Oh, that's right. He was there for the Medical Association. meeting?
Mhm.
Right.
Now, there is,
I know who arranged that, Bernie.
I wonder.
Yeah.
It wasn't me. I can't take credit for that.
That was Dr. Crumlin, wasn't it?
It was Dr. Crumlin and Dr. Wilson.
Okay, okay.
now there is a really interesting question to chat about how the center works with local organizations. This is from Cecil Cahoon again. He asked, would you discuss how the teacher training is being conducted in locations where the traveling exhibit is taken? For example, in Spartanburg, did the 7 district administrations have to approve the training for the teachers? He says he's curious about how district administrators statewide have responded to the offer of teacher training, given the current attention to curriculum standards and the teaching of accurate history.
So Frank, you want to talk about that? So we teach civil rights history, not critical race theory. And that's what I repeat over and over again.
And just to build upon that, state of South Carolina has as a law since 1989 to teach Black history at the 8th grade level. And
So
so,
pause,
yes,
who's from South Carolina? How many know of that statute? There's a statute that called for the teaching of Black history. I think it was from '87. What was the famous Education Act?
Starting in 8th grade or?
primarily
At 8th grade level.
Yeah, at the 8th grade level, and a textbook was published to support the teaching of this topic.
as a matter of fact,
In 8th grade in 1987. I remember being taught that.
What's the title of Becky's book, History what?
Where's the book?
just to add to that, the State Department earmarks $250,000 annually to curate resources to teach Black history every year, $250,000. It's not widely published. You're within the school districts, you have some familiarity, but there's $250,000 earmarked as grant funds so that any organization, school districts, or folks who are interested in applying to create what they want, which is lesson plans, you can apply and you can actually receive those funds to create lesson plans. But in the earlier years, there were not just lesson plans. There were binders created with resources. There were books created that document the history of African Americans in South Carolina. And so we are just doing what was initiated by the state. We are gathering other resources, not necessarily in a book format, but we're providing those same resources that the community helps us to collect, that help to document the history, and then we provide training on how to teach that. So that's where we land as it relates to whether or not we're doing what we're supposed to do, given the climate that we're currently in. We only teach the facts, which is what we model. we teach teachers not to be subjective, to give students the chance to analyze and think critically about what's in front of them, giving them all of the resources, not just what's been provided in their school textbooks. Allow them to make decisions on what they think about the information and develop their own perspectives, which is historical thinking, which is required by state standards, critical analysis, which is also required by state standards, because state standards for social studies encourage teachers and educators to prepare students to be college and career ready. And they have identified specific skills that students need to be equipped with before they leave high school. And so when you look at the standards, all we're doing is creating a platform for them to do that, utilizing actual facts, actual documents, and resources that we've acquired that document the history of African Americans in the state. So that's the work that we do.
Yeah.
And I'll say in a place like Florence District 3, Lake City area, we were invited by the superintendent to come to that community. So many times when we're going in and doing professional development, is very often at the invitation of local school leaders. In fact, it was not the superintendent. It was a school board member who heard the presentation we gave at some forum and went back to the superintendent and said, they're coming to Lake City. And that's how we ended up going.
All right, I see Cecil has his hand up on Zoom, so go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Dr. Donaldson and Frank, both of you very much for what you've shared this evening. Where are these binders that Frank talked about, the resources that have been curated? Where are they housed, and how do educators who are interested in this content access them? Are they online, for example?
They're not. As a matter of fact, we've been trying to track down those resources that were curated in the earlier years, in the 90s and so on. We don't know. We assume that they're somewhere in a warehouse because they're not actively being used.
The textbooks were in a warehouse.
Yes.
And I saw those when I joined the faculty 20 plus years ago. They're now regularly around. But one thing I'll say that is available that many may not know. So Frank just mentioned $250,000 annually is being dispersed for educational resources. Some of that money goes to the African American History Calendar, which actually has curriculum as a part of it. Most do not know that. There are teacher aids that go with the calendar. Also on the South Carolina Department of Social Studies website, there are a series of resources that almost are hidden and buried. So for example, the Avery Research Center in the College of Charleston has published something called the Bugle, which is a comic book history of African Americans in South Carolina. The PDFs are readily accessible, can be easily downloaded. They've been there for years. It's called the Bugle. Other educational resources are there. There are virtual tours of civil rights sites that are there. I think there might be a virtual tour of the Simkins house that's there.
In addition, the book that was created is in PDF format on the state website.
So the title of the book is called
African Americans
in the Palmetto State.
I have that.
That book was published originally in the late 80s and republished the subsequent
Say it again,
edition.
please.
South Carolina, and the Palmetto State. African Americans, in the Palmetto State.
But I mean, you said that had something to do with the EIA, the special improvement after the 80s.
Yes. Yes, it was. That was on Riley, right? Yeah, it dates back to the mid-80s, that law.
And it went into effect in 1989. So for over 30 years, we see how well it's been implemented.
That state required a certain percentage of money every year to be invested in public education.
Yes, it did.
That the legislature ever since then has passed a waiver, a budget rider waiver, and fallen short of education funding. And let's say something, whom the gentleman raised his hand is a regional organizer for the National Education Association, and knows more than anybody. This will have something. I was on the committee that formed. As a matter of fact, our study group bogarted Charlie Williams, who is the state superintendent. And that was one of the most frustrating experiences of my life because I think that there were some people on the committee who were sincere. But what they did was they offered over the three summers that 3 years that I participated, they offered teachers the opportunity to come and take those courses, to take courses and get graduate school credit, but didn't require them to teach it at all. So for a lot of teachers, it was a summer getaway. And the subject material that they wanted to concentrate on was the life of a free Black person in Charleston. I think it was Jehu Jones. That's who they wanted to concentrate on. And I, in the words of one of our friends, who's now an ancestor, there were no free Black folk. They were just loose.
And if you take that textbook as gospel, there was no civil rights movement. I don't recall any of the stuff we've discussed today in that book, except Donaldson Massey.
It was more biography.
And if I may add one more comment, Dr. Gallman, to your point, and to reiterate how important the work of archiving collections has been for us. We were working in Greenville, South Carolina. And we were going through a collection, trying to figure out what pieces we needed to bring back to the university. This individual, a Black nationalist. And so she had saved everything.
Tell us who she is.
I know what she is.
Miss Wangaza.
Epia Wangaza. Yes,
Apia.
Apia. And so
Part of her collection is now being archived.
yes.
Oh, wonderful.
And so in the process of going through things at her place, we ran across one of the binders. It was mildew. It was in very bad condition, but we could read the cover. And I was able to look and I saw your name. I saw your name. And we reached out to you as a result of that because we wanted to figure out
What happened to the binder?
where are the binders and what number of them were made, because this was for 3rd grade. So to your point, it wasn't just for 8th grade. This was a 3rd grade binder. And so we were trying to figure out where the rest of them may have been housed today so that we can figure out how to recreate those materials and move forward.
Involved in the state education. Do you know her?
I do.
She was the director of that project.
And I think
If she's still around, she may have.
another collection we have that may have it is, wasn't Willie Harrop part of that group?
Yeah.
Willie Harrop.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting question in the chat, maybe you know something about from Annette that says, any updates on the old St. Simon Episcopal Church in Peak?
I have no updates. However, I have been in communication with them about restoring that church. Ironically, the church is connected to one of the civil rights figures we do research on, named Reverend Simon Bowie. And Reverend Bowie's family is from that area. And so there are 2 structures they're trying to preserve in Peak, which is between here and Newberry.
Yes.
There's a historic African-American Episcopal church, which is on private land. It's a beautiful sanctuary that they're hoping to move to a new spot to restore that site, and as well as the Bowie family home. As always, it's getting the resources needed for that. But they are trying to seek funding for both the relocation and the preservation of the house. And I'm supposed to take a trip out there at some point at the end of the semester to see it.
Now, for those on Zoom, I have gone ahead and put a link to the African Americans in the Palmetto State PDF online. I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen so folks in the room can see it as well. But while I do that, there is a question in the chat also, and this is again the book that they're talking about here. You can easily find it online, just type in.
That's a new cover. I haven't seen that one.
Oh, I think this is an update from, I want to say 2006 thereabouts. But yeah, this is again accessible online. I put a link to it in the chat. Make sure folks get a link to it via email this week at some point.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Dr. Green, is that from the same site that has the other resources?
I believe it is. I just did a search for that, but yeah, it's ed.sc.gov.
The challenge, the frustration I would say openly is that those resources, which many people invested a great deal of time and energy in, are just not regularly marketed, promoted, or accessible. They're on the website, but you almost have to go digging to find it.
Bobby, just a personal reflection in terms of my moving to South Carolina, reluctantly, to say the least, back in 1979, 78. And I was leaving CORE in Brooklyn and another political club. I was extremely active. I called myself somewhat of a historian because I had this incredible number of professors where I went to when I went to Howard. So I thought I was very hip and knowledgeable. And I really did not respect what was here in South Carolina. It saved my life. It really did. And you were a part of that. But just in terms of finding out the information about my people here in this state, and all that means, and my commitment is to make sure that everybody hears about it. But your efforts have, in fact, been very helpful. I want to thank you for it.
Well, thank you. And one of the things I think I want to echo is it's interesting. So many people that we've talked to have lived extraordinary lives, had extraordinary experiences, but don't even recognize it. Unless somehow sort of either I underscore it or highlight it. And part of the work we've done, particularly in the downtown movement of civil rights and demonstration, students from Allen and Benedict and other places, they were just students, left campus one day, involved in the movement, not fully aware of the consequences. And Frank, can you show me, I want to go back to this screen and show you just one example of consequences that most people did not understand. So we have a walking tour in downtown Columbia, and that walking tour started with Mayor Steve Benjamin in 2012. It was called Columbia 63, Our Story Matters. This is Judge Ernest Finney announcing that tour in 2013. Judge Finney, like I thought, this would be a one-year initiative. This is the 10th anniversary. And it goes back to what Ms. Hammock said. The more we started doing programming, the more it took traction in the community. So there is a walking tour, there's a virtual tour that goes down Main Street. But the original site is here at the African American History Monument, which has its own interesting history. On the backside, you'll see the chair of the committee was Glenn McConnell. Very interesting. But we talk about, so we go from Reconstruction, we walk across the State House grounds and the demise of Reconstruction. We talk about these two extraordinary figures of 1895, Robert Smalls, Ben Tillman, and the statement Robert Smalls makes on the grounds of at the 1895 Constitutional Convention. My race needs no special defense, but the past history of them in this country proves them equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life. So I quote Robert Smalls as we walk down Main Street. And I tell them essentially what this movement is about is fulfilling the very word that Robert Smalls gave in 1895. And we talk about the State House grounds as being a theater in the fight for American democracy. The State House grounds being a theater in the fight, like I said, a theater in the fight. These are members of the KKK in 1955, marching on the grounds of the State House. These are students in February of 1968 on the grounds of the State House, calling out police brutality following the tragedy in Orangeburg, where 3 people and over 30 others are wounded. 3 people are killed, over 30 wounded. And as you march down, as we take the walk down Main, we get to our first marker. And this is where I want to sort of end here. This is a march on the grounds of the State House of South Carolina on March 2nd, 1961. It is within days of the students in jail in Rock Hill. In fact, they leave jail on March 1st. Friendship 9. They leave jail on March 1st. March 2nd, several hundred students come to downtown Columbia. And they come to Zion Baptist Church, 801 Washington Street. And they march. And it's an ordinary march. But when they get to the grounds of the State House, they're told they have 15 minutes to march in silence. Well, after the 15 minutes, after they leave Zion, they get to the State House, and there's a minister on the ground whose name is Reverend David Carter. Reverend David Carter was from Barnwell. Reverend David Carter was a Baptist, but who sounded like a Pentecostal. And as they're marching on the 15th minute, Reverend David Carter tells the young people that if you want your freedom, you need to say so.
Okay.
They break their silence and they start marching and dancing and singing around the State House. We know this because of police reports. We know this because of testimony in the courtroom. We know this because of the photographer who was on the site, whose name is Cecil Williams, who took these pictures 60 years ago. And we know this because we have moving footage of what took place. So here is Cecil Williams behind on the side of these young men and women. One of the young men and women was this woman here. She was 16 years old. She was the president of the state youth NAACP. She got arrested that day, but had no idea of the powerful consequences of the arrest and the legal ruling. Her name in 1961 was Leola Clement. Today, her name is Leola Robinson Simpson, who just retired as a member of the General Assembly from Greenville County. 1961, she is the youth president, joining these students who are from Claflin, South Carolina State, Benedict College, and high schools around South Carolina. Among those arrested that day was this gentleman, who was training to be a minister, whose name was Lenny Glover. Now notice these 2 signs. They're both striking. One is very famous when we go around the country. Thank God for Mississippi. It keeps South Carolina from being at the bottom of the list. That was from 1961. The other sign says, this store bears the blood of Lenny Glover, beware of woolworths. Both appear in Jet magazine. One is taken within a month of the march in the State House. So the march in the State House is March 2nd, 1961. On March 5th, 1961, Lenny Glover goes into Woolworths. Does anyone remember where Woolworths was in Columbia? The corner of Main and Hampton, today where the Marriott Hotel is. Lenny Glover goes in, sits down, and is stabbed in broad daylight by an unknown assailant. Lenny Glover is sent, fortunately, he was not sent to Baptist on what is Richland Memorial. He was taken to the Good Samaritan Waverly Hospital. And there, a very skilled surgeon who was a president of the local NAACP named Dr. C.O. Span saved this man's life. And in the larger presentation, I actually have the receipt Dr. Span sends to the NAACP to be paid for taking care of Lenny Glover. Was it $250, Frank? I have it. I think it was $250. He was in hospital for over 3 weeks. But luckily, so Lenny Glover recovers from his wound and is back downtown wearing this sign. Someone else in the march that day was the pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church, Dr. Benjamin J. Glover, who later becomes the president of Allen University twice. His daughter, Ovida Glover, is now the current branch president of the Columbia NAACP. And she was one of the first students to integrate public schools in September of 1963. Another person who was a part of that group was Dr. Millicent Brown, who you'll hear from in a few days. Dr. Glover was arrested that day. Also arrested that day was this gentleman here with the Derby. That's Dr. Glover, by the way. The gentleman with the Derby was the state conference president, whose name is Reverend I. E. Quincy Newman. Well, Reverend Newman was supposed to pay the bail for the students once they went to jail. No one thought he would be in jail with them. Certainly, now this is a new picture. Nobody's seen this before. How do I know? Cecil Williams just uncovered it in his vast collection. So let me go back. This is the same day as Reverend Newman. So Cecil literally is following them. This is one image. This is the other image. This photograph is in front of the monument. These are students from Mather Academy in Camden. This is a guy named Duke, Missouri, Clarence, Missouri, who was a student at South Carolina State. This gentleman is named Stanley, Arthur Stanley Jr. His father was Mr. NAACP of Darwin County named Manstein. Arthur Stanley only months earlier got kicked out of Mayo High School because he engaged in a student demonstration. Because he is marked as this expelled student radical, the only school that would admit him was Mather Academy. So he goes to Mather and he organized his classmates and says, we're going to Columbia and we're going to the State House. Those students at Mather get to Zion and Reverend Newman tells Duke, Missouri and his classmate, I want you to join the Mather students. Now, Duke, Missouri and his classmates had planned to come to Zion and go back to Kansas. They had no plans to be arrested in downtown Columbia. And they were quite upset when Reverend David Carter started preaching about your rights and say so. Until recently, there was no image of Duke, Missouri and his roommate in the protest. We knew they were arrested because we have their names on a court document. So that young man scratching his head is this young man, James Clyde. And he was elated about this image because he knew he was in the movement, though others said he was not. So here we have a court record and the photograph underscoring James Clyde's role leading this protest. Now there's a longer story. If you read this book, he'll tell you how he had on his brand new three-piece green suit, lime green that day, because he just knew he was going elsewhere. And he went to jail, he never wore it again. Here's two more things that I'll put. This is another photograph that just appeared. So John H. McCrae was the editor of the Lighthouse and Informer newspaper, a key civil rights newspaper from the 1940s and 50s that was supported at one point by Modjeska, Simkins, and Brent can tell you the relationship between John McCrae and Modjeska. They did not drink tea together. Here are students, here are students. This, by the way, I kept trying to figure out where this building was. What's the building? The Wig. The Wig, the restaurant on the ground level. That's that building. I did not recognize it until recently. They're renovating it. And they stripped away some of the facade, and I now recognize where it is. So these are students marching down Main Street. This is Mrs. Newman. I be Quincy Newman's wife. This is Emily Newman, who recently passed away. Emily Newman, Morris Newman. But here is a gentleman whose name was Frederick Hart. Frederick Hart was a 17-year-old white student at the University of South Carolina, who comes on the scene. And according to Frederick Hart, a policeman looks at him and says, are you a member of the NAACP? And Frederick Hart moves close and says, yes, I just joined. And we believe this is a mark of students on their way to jail. They will march through the streets of Columbia to jail. Frederick Hart is expelled from the University of South Carolina. He goes to Washington, D.C., and he becomes a very famous artist. If you've ever been to the National Cathedral and seen some of the great sculptures there, some of that is done by Frederick Hart. And if you've ever been to the National Mall and you've been to the Vietnam Memorial, the wall of famous, right across the sidewalk is a statue of 3 soldiers that was carved by Frederick Hart. Now, Frederick Hart was ridiculed by SLED. And someone said, he must be a communist. And the SLED said, no, he must be a Unitarian. I'm serious. Either one, controversial. This is Frederick Hart in jail. All right. Between 2 students from Benedict College. So James Clyburn, Frederick Hart, Ida Quincy Newman, Lenny Glover, all are part of a landmark Supreme Court case called Edwards versus South Carolina that was ruled 60 years ago, February 21st, 1963, that said that declared that the states may not make criminal the peaceful expression of unpopular views. This litigation, this ruling is used in a series of major demonstrations across the country. When you read the legal rulings that enable Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to engage in the demonstrations in downtown Birmingham, when people are attacked by fire hoses and police dogs, Fred Shuttlesworth's attorneys cite Edwards v. South Carolina. There's another case which I think is called Hosea Williams versus George Wallace. It's a case that enabled the march from Selma to Montgomery, citing Edwards versus South Carolina. And Brett, which is the more recent case?
Roe v. Campbell.
And
Occupiers versus Haley.
versus Nikki Haley. All cite this famous. Now, I say this because this is now a legal ruling taught in nearly every major law school in the country. But until I saw it at Columbia in '63, I had never heard of the case. It had never been mentioned except one time, now in retrospect. The lead local lawyer for the case was Matthew J. Perry. And he cited Edwards as one of its most impactful cases, not knowing. Now, the gentleman on the left, that's the Reverend James Edwards.
Okay.
So we called him to talk about his memories of the case. He's like, man, what case? He had no idea what we were talking about. He graduated from Benedict, did not know, he had no clue that this became this landmark case. And on Main Street, in front of Hall's Chop House, you will see this monument with the names of 189 people who are part of that case. And not a week goes by now that we start hearing from some of those young men and women who are now late 70s, early 80s, or their families. This is Dee Dee Wright, who is from Greenville, who just recently published a book called The Right Thing. And so part of, for me, what's most rewarding in this work, that now I'll tell you what James Edwards told me. When we unveiled this marker in 2021, he said, I'm 82 years old. Do you know what it means for me to run my fingers across my name on a piece of marble, and it's not in a cemetery? Not in a cemetery. And to watch James Edwards, all of his grandchildren, that was rewarding.
Yes.
So that's what we're called to do. And our work continues. So Brett, I want to stop, entertain other questions.
Let me put a personal footnote on the Edwards ESC case.
Was it you against, for you also?
That the ruling from Brody Campbell established the state law, which modeled the law in Washington DC, which was drawn from Edwards. And the issue is that you do not need a permission to use public property. And so it is now a reservation process. As long as you're not breaking a law, you can be on public property. And they can't throw you off of public property like they did the people in Edwards, like they did the Brody Campbell. Our sign was arrested. But in the occupier case, there were 10 people arrested that were on the grounds, and they were told to leave the grounds. Well, being on the grounds isn't illegal, and so they all got like $10,000 for an illegal arrest. But that stand up with 181 arrests set a measure that ran across the country, and we still contribute to free speech here in South Carolina and Washington, D.C., that you simply make a reservation to use public property.
Well, here's the other irony. So on March 2nd, 1961, when those students gathered, another person, by the way, who was in that group was Isaac Washington, a local publisher of newspaper. Also in that group was Ike Williams,
Yes.
who becomes the chief aide to Congressman Clive, and his twin sister, who I've interviewed. There was never any intention of a legal fight. They were just going to the State House. But Jack Greenberg, who was one of their national lawyers, said it was such a pristine case that they sort of performed the role as they had hoped. The point where it became the test case.
Oh, wow.
If any of those students had gotten rowdy, if any of them had gotten out of line, it would have disturbed the whole legal effort. But they were well-trained and followed the dictates as planned. And here comes Matthew Perry to take the case forward. Matthew Perry, Lincoln Jenkins, and there was another attorney out of Greenville whose name was Donald Sampson, who was also one of the attorneys.
And there's a quick question in chat. That's Dr. Donaldson, have you considered adding Dr. Grace McFadden's 13-part oral history of South Carolina to your collection?
Grace Jordan McFadden is why I'm here in South Carolina. Grace Jordan McFadden's, it's more than, what are you saying?
It says here 13.
Oh, it's more than that. It's much larger, but I know this because it's now digitized. And it's now, like, you mean the Request for Human Rights
Yes.
project? Yes, absolutely. When Grace Jordan McFadden retired, her void was so vast, they hired two people to replace her, Bobby Donaldson and Belinda Littlefield. We both were hired to replace her.
How about that?
20
What a crew.
plus years ago. And I'll say too, a lot of the work that we are doing now builds on the work of Grace Jordan McFadden, Willie Hereford, who was a pioneering archivist, and Dr. Tom Johnson, who was in the South Carolina Library. They really set the stage and opened the door. And Dr. McFadden, particularly because in addition to a lot of the records, we now have the voices. So she interviewed James McKinney, Modjeska Simkins, Ida Quincy Newman, John McCrae. And so some of the recordings we have now that we utilize were things done by Dr. McFadden in the late 70s and early 80s. Powerful interview, by the way, with Septima Clark. As well.
There was an attorney, his first name was John. And John,
John, what?
yes.
Harold Bulwer she interviewed.
Mhm.
By the way, Harold Bulwer's papers are now being processed, including some great material about Briggs versus Elliott. John Ware Harper's papers are part of the collection.
That's what I was asking. Was my right?
The transcript of that, right?
I'll give you the FBI record.
Yeah, well, I think on that note, so let's give our gentleman here a wonderful round of applause. We've always agreed to have Dr. Donaldson join us at the Modjeska School here. He's always a friend and ally of our school. So if you enjoyed tonight's event, please be aware of the fact that we do have some exciting events coming up in the next couple of weeks. Of course, on April 30th, this Sunday, we have the deeper dive about the film, The Uprising of 34, which is about the great labor struggle in the South during the Great Depression. And that'll be led by Dr. Terry Taylor from the Citadel.
And that's a public event. It's not closed to students, or Sunday events are generally open. And this Uprising of 34 was a movie that was made in the late 80s, and I talked to the people that were producing it. And they were as amazed as I was that nobody in the town were, the people they were filming in Honeypath, South Carolina, remember the fact that there was a massacre there in 1934. And this film has footage from the time. It's just incredible. And the story made it to Point of View, the PBS nationwide special, and showed in 49 states. Is which state it is.
And I'll add that Kerry is one of the best historians I know. He's one of the best instructors I know. He's one of the best organizers I know. Make sure you stand up.
All right, again, history denied, ladies and gentlemen. That's the theme of the Modjeska School. And of course, next Monday is
Available for purchase. Available for purchase. I'll handle that. if you
Okay.
need.
All right, and of course, next Monday is May Day. So we're gonna have Carrie Taylor joining us once again to talk a bit more about the rich labor history of South Carolina, especially the Charleston area, and how this all relates to right to work laws and how many of those right to work laws have their origins in South Carolina, in the Deep South, and some of the labor struggles that, again, are not as well known as they should be. And then really quickly, May 8th, we're going to talk about school equalization in South Carolina and segregation of schools here with our guest Cecil Cahoon, Dr. Millicent Brown, and Professor John Kramer. They'll be joining us on May 8th. So we've got some really exciting classes coming up. Again, we hope to see you this coming Sunday, certainly next Monday as well. Brett?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming and help us pay the mortgage. Leave money.